All right. So worst case, you're talking to a defense contractor, you get through all this pre-readiness stuff, then you find out they're not ready. What happens then? Hello. It's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Mr. Fernando Machado. Fernando, how are you?
Doing good, man. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all those things. Helps me out. Thank you so much in advance. Fernando, tell us about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
So I joined the Army in 2001 as an infantryman. We ended up leading the invasion into Iraq in 2003 with the 3rd Infantry Division. I ended up getting out in 2004. I wanted to try my hand in law enforcement, so I went and became a Border Patrol agent and discovered that law enforcement was not for me. I then used my GI Bill and I pursued my degree in information system security. And then my first job was an IT security analyst for the Department of the Army as a contractor at Netcom over at Fort Huachuca. And then ever since then, I've stayed in the cybersecurity field, worked for some of the large primes. I opened up my business back in 2018 to help with clients with cybersecurity. And then in 2019, I started hearing rumblings about the DoD creating, this thing that we all know as CMMC. And then in January of 2020, I joined the Standards Management Industry Working Group under the Cyber AB. And then I ended up attending one of the first provisional assessor classes back in 2020. So I'm provisional assessor number 8 overall. And then in July of 2022, we became the 29th authorized C3PAO. And then, as you know, Jacob, the rule became effective on December 16th. So we got reauthorized on January 3rd. And then since then, we've conducted nearly 20 JSVAs during that time period. And at the time of this recording, we just completed our 5th CMMC assessment.
Folks, today we're going to be really focusing in on what you need to know when you're getting ready for your CMMC assessment and what to expect. The CMMC assessment process version 2 came out several weeks ago. The news cycle in CMMC was crazy for a little bit. But tell us about the assessment process and what you're feeling about it as a document in comparison to the old version.
This document is a lot smaller than the old version. And also, one of the great things about it is it gives you kind of those guardrails of kind of like the phases to how assessments are to be conducted. Overall, it's not very prescriptive, but it says here are some of the things that you shall do and what you should do. So it kind of gives the assessment teams and the C3PAOs a lot of, flexibility, because assessing a 3-person company is not going to be the same thing as assessing, say, a 3,000-person company with various locations and sites. So it kind of gives us that flexibility to kind of pivot one way or the other.
So in the CMMC assessment process, there's a number of phases. There are 4. Can we talk about phase 1? What is the purpose of that?
So in phase 1, we're conducting that pre-assessment phase. The purpose of phase 1 is to evaluate from the C3PO's perspective if the contractor is adequately prepared to undergo an assessment. That's the whole purpose of phase 1. And if you read in the CMMC assessment process document, phase 1 is actually conduct the pre-assessment to see if the contractor is even ready to go. During that scoping call, we're asking things like, how does CUI flow throughout your environment? Will you be printing CUI? Will you have any removable media that contains CUI? All of these questions that we start to ask you kind of helps us paint a picture of your environment.
What type of documentation are you asking for during phase 1?
So during phase 1, we're looking at their system security plan just to ensure that they have policies, procedures, and any other relevant artifacts. And just remember, at this time, we're just looking to make sure that you have sufficient evidence to be able to go through an assessment. We're not evaluating anything at that time, but we want to be able to say, okay, it looks like they have all the right pieces of evidence at a high level. This contractor is ready to proceed with a level 2 assessment.
What are the typical things that you'll see trip up people during the phase 1 session?
If they're using an external cloud service provider to process, store, or transmit CUI, did that contractor ensure that that cloud service provider is at least FedRAMP moderate authorized or at least FedRAMP moderate equivalent in accordance with the DoD's memo back from 2023? Another thing that tends to trip them up are things like, do you even have a cage code? Without a valid cage code, the C3PO can't proceed with an assessment. And I know that some folks out there that are saying, well, if you're a contractor, shouldn't you have a cage code? Well, to a degree, right? Some contractors are just getting into the space where they want to start to do this. Also, typically managed service providers don't have a cage code because they've never had a reason to go get one. So this is another part that could trip people up. One thing that I think folks need to understand is that If your assessment for whatever reason is postponed or canceled, the C3PAO is still required to complete and upload the pre-assessment form and upload it into EMAS.
So whenever you get the SSP, do you expect to see the granular level of detail even going down to the assessment objective in that SSP, or is the the control level, is that sufficient?
I have a personal preference of I would like to see the system security plan down to the assessment objective level, which makes our lives easier when it comes to assessing the controls. But we've seen it both ways. We've seen it where it was at the control level, but then the contractor had a massive paragraph and it actually had all of the determination statements written in there. You know, not my favorite, but it's not my job to come in there and say, I like this or don't like that, right? That's what we call bringing emotional baggage to the assessment. And we try not to do that, right? We try to say, okay, this is what they've provided us. And as long as it meets the intent of the assessment objectives, then we have to score it as such.
What if they're not there at all and they haven't even done 171A at all?
Yeah, then that is going to basically be a, as, Jacob Horn always says, that proverbial false start. Like, yep, you are not ready.
Folks, it's really important to understand the 110 security controls from NIST 800-171, revision 2, all those numbers and acronyms. There's another document that's super important. That's the assessment objective. So it's a one-to-many relationship in most cases. You can have one control, and then you can have a lot of requirements within those controls. And the assessment objectives, they break those requirements out into testable, measurable statements. And so, like I found this doing RMF work a while ago, if you don't go down to the assessment objective level, you're going to miss stuff and it's going to come back to bite you during an assessment.
Agreed.
Tell us about validating the scope and any problems that could come up in that section there.
Validating the scope comes into play when we're reviewing your SSP. And one of the things that I like to start with is kind of like that data flow diagram. Show us how, CUI gets into your environment, and then kind of show us all of the different area where it goes into. This is where we start asking questions like, do you have on-prem servers that contain CUI? What cloud service providers are going to be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI? Are you leveraging a managed service provider, or are you handling everything internally? Do you print CUI? And then, of course, asking these types of questions, then it kind of starts to lead. Some folks will say, oh, well, we print CUI. And I can say, well, based on your CUI data flow diagram, I don't see that printer in there anywhere. And so that could be a potential showstopper on validating that assessment scope. Like, our job as the C3PAO is to validate your story. But if your story is not making sense with the questions that we're asking, then it's going to be a non-starter out of the gate.
If you're a C3PAO, you're evaluating, the scope, you're evaluating the SSP, and then you find a discrepancy. If you find something that wasn't put in scope that should have been, well, that means that security controls were not implemented in that segment, that section.
Agreed.
And it very well could be. You got to come back later. We can't do it right now. And then we'll get to this. But with the availability issues of assessors, you want to get this right the first time.
It's absolutely crucial that you go in there 100% believing that you're ready to go and you have all your I's dotted, T's are crossed to make the most efficient time of your assessment.
When we talk about evidence, I was messaging someone and they mentioned the NFO controls. And they're like, I'm not sure that those are necessary. And those are all of the policy and procedural controls that NIST didn't include in the 110 controls for 800-171, but they say that they assume that everyone's just implementing them. But if they don't have policies and procedures, from your perspective, what's the word there?
If you don't have policies and procedures, chances are good you're probably not going to pass, because a lot of the assessment objectives, as you know, Jacob, have either to define, specify, or identify something, and that is typically done through organizational policies or procedures. So if you don't have those at all, then you're probably not going to pass.
In phase one, part of validating the assessment scope is external service providers. Now, as we know, the final rule includes underneath that ESP umbrella, cloud service providers, but also IT managed service providers as well. What does that look like when you have an IT managed service provider servicing the in-scope environment for the contractor?
An external service provider, if they're helping that contractor achieve compliance, is going to be part of their scope. And typically what we've seen a customer or shared responsibility matrix that's established that delineates what the IT service provider is going to be responsible for and what the contractor is going to be responsible for in the implementation and the maintenance of those controls. And so we've already gone through a CMMC assessment that way, where we had a managed service provider and the client go through the assessment, and they showed us those clear delineated responsibilities and who's responsible for what. And we were able to get through the assessment with no problem.
A lot of people are going to be tripped up there because there's so many MSPs out there that are not CMMC focused, and they just don't know. They just don't know. And honestly, I think a lot of MSPs should just offload the defense contractors to those who are focused on CMMC, because without a specific focus, there's no way they can service defense contractors in a compliant manner.
It's one of the reasons why we ask the question, are you employing a managed service provider, that is helping you, that has access to your environment, or are you handling all of the stuff internally? And then that's typically where we start to get the questions of, well, we don't know if they're going to join us at the table, or, are they going to get certified or not? I mean, like we know in the 32 rule, right, it doesn't require external service providers to get certified, but right, it actually does help if they were to get certified with their workload. Otherwise, that service provider is just going to be sitting at assessments over and over and over again.
All right. So we're almost towards the end of phase one. There's what's called a pre-assessment form. What is that?
So the pre-assessment form is a top document that is provided to us through the CMMC EMAS. There are two document templates that the C3POs will work out of. The first one is the CMMC pre-assessment form template. And then the second one is the CMMC Level 2 assessment results template. The pre-assessment form template is going to gather just very basic information about your organization, right? Company's name, UEI, your address, city, state, business phone number, website, and then what field are you in, right? Are you part of the defense industrial base? Are you a managed service provider? Are you a security service provider? And then, are you going with a enterprise or enclaved approach? It's going to have the C3PO's contract date, the assessment planning, starting and completion date, and then, the C3PO's unique identifier and the name of the organization. And then there's other tabs in there, like, who the assessment official is going to be. This is the person that is going to be ultimately responsible, that is going to affirm to the government that they're meeting and maintaining compliance. And then a technical POC, point of contact, that we're going to need for that. If they are using a managed service provider, we'll need their information as well. And then the C3PO's lead assessor will be input there, as well as any other relevant team members. And then that document gets uploaded to EMAS no matter what. So whether you move forward successfully with beginning your level 2 assessment, or if your level 2 assessment is either canceled or postponed, the C3PO is still going to be required to upload that document into EMAS.
All right. So worst case, you're talking to a defense contractor, you get through all this pre-readiness stuff, get your pre-assessment form populated, then you find out they're not ready. So what happens then?
If the lead CCA determines that the contractor is not ready to undergo an assessment, then they're going to inform the company affirming official that, hey, this OSC is not ready. They're going to provide that explanation in writing to the OSC, and they're going to explain as to why they're recommending to suspend the assessment. And then from that point, us as being C3POs, we're not allowed to consult, provide any implementation assistance or advice or anything like that. So we're basically saying, hey, we're suspending the assessment based on the things that we've seen. We do not believe that you're ready to move forward. And then once we do that, we'll try to figure out ways of kind of settling affairs, like things with the contract. We typically try to be flexible. So if a contractor is not ready, we could say, hey, you're not ready today, but our next available slot is probably, maybe 4 or 5 months down the road. Let's go ahead and move you to that time period. And then, just come back and see us when you think you're ready at that time. But either way, right, that CMMC pre-assessment form is still going to get uploaded into EMAS.
Now, when you say, sorry, you're not ready, can you kind of give them a little hit, like what the problem is, or are you allowed to do that?
No, we just say, hey, based on the things that we saw, you don't have sufficient documentation that we think that you're going to pass an assessment.
So we are into phase 2. What's the purpose of phase 2? What happens?
So in phase 2, we're actually going to conduct the assessment and assess against conformity in accordance with NIST 800, 171, and 171A.
Let's talk about the first piece of phase 2. What can people expect from the in-brief meeting?
During the in-brief meeting, the lead CACA is going to lead that. And prior to the start of the assessment, and then his job is going to be to record official meeting minutes and any questions and answers provided during that in-brief. The assessment team is then going to assess conformity in accordance with 171A and 171 Revision 2. And then the requirements are going to be scored on one of 3 bases. It's either going to be met, or not applicable. And then during that time period, the C3PAO is going to conduct a quality assurance review during the assessment, and they're going to observe the assessment team's conduct and management of the CMMC assessment process to make sure that all the correct questions and everything are being asked. And then at the end of each assessment day, the assessment team is going to conduct what's called a daily checkpoint with the contractor, and they're going to summarize the progress, and we're going to have discussions about any additional items for coordination or just things that need additional clarification at the end of each day. So as you're progressing through the days, you're going to know at the end of each day how you are progressing through the 110 controls / 320 assessment objectives.
I know there's no typical assessment, but let's just say we got a small business, 50 folks or so. How long would that assessment take?
The way that we do it is we have a Monday through Friday schedule. So Monday through Thursday, we have the various control families that we assess. And then we leave Friday for reserved as needed for any, if we need to come out to do an on-site visit, if we need to ask additional questions, or even reserving that day specifically for just a outbrief during that time period, which I think leads into phase 3.
Now, let's talk about the sampling. And folks, 800-171A, that's the assessment Bible. That's what you have to do this. You have to do it as you implement because you don't want to get struck by surprise. This is what the assessor will be looking at. So you should be looking at the same thing and doing a self-assessment as you implement the controls and do your own readiness assessment even before you get to the C3PAO. So there's no surprises. Describe how a C3PAO would do that sampling process, and then maybe what happens if you're finding some maybe a little sketch stuff in there.
Let's say you have a contractor that has, 6, 7 sites, right, that all fall under one SSP. One of the things that we could do is we can apply that non-statistical sampling to it. Then we could say, okay, out of the 6 or 7 sites, we're going to go check on 3 and see if, these are good to go at random, right? So we're just checking these. If it turns out that there is something wrong or something is questionable, now that allows the assessment team to increase that sample evaluation to make sure that that security requirement is met.
Okay.
And one of the good things about the sampling is it allows us to basically cover systems at various locations, but while still saying, okay, we've assessed 3 out of the 7 locations. All 3 came back good. I can reasonably say that potentially the other 4 are good as well. And it's really going to depend on the C3PAO. Some C3PAOs are a little bit more risk averse and they may say, we want to go visit all 7 sites. Other C3PAOs will say, let's go visit 2 or 3. And so that statistical sampling is really left to our discretion.
Hey folks, question for you. Do you know the status of your compliance controls right now? Like right now? We know that real-time visibility is critical for security, but when it comes to our GRC programs, we rely on point-in-time checks. But get this, more than 8,000 companies like Atlassian and Quora have continuous visibility into their controls with Vanta. Here's the gist. Vanta brings automation to evidence collection across 30 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. They also centralize key workflows like policies, access reviews, and reporting, and help you get security questionnaires done 5 times faster with AI. Now that's a new way to GRC. Learn more about Vanta at vanta.com/GRC Academy. Now back to the episode. All right, we're doing it, folks. Here is control AC L2311. That means access control level 2, 311. And the title is authorized access control. Here's the requirement. Here's all the discussion information. And then here's some further discussion, even more goodness for you. So if you do all of that, you should be good, right? Nope. You got to go down here to the assessment guidance, and you got to go down and look at these assessment objectives and make sure that your implementation has addressed every one of these assessment objectives. Tell us more, Fernando.
Yeah. So when we're assessing this, right, we'll take 311 Alpha, for example, authorized users are identified. And we typically ask the contractor, explain to us how you identify your authorized users. And in most cases, typically some of the things that we've seen is they say, we've got this onboarding checklist. The user comes in, they get an employment offer, they go through a background check. And then once they do that, we submit a ticket to the IT team to create an account for that user in accordance with role-based access control with the role that we hired them to do. And so once we see that, we're like, okay, now can you show us kind of like the list of authorized users that you have? And then they'll say, here are the list of the authorized users that we have access to the CUI environment. One of the biggest problems that we see is that if you fail this control, 311 is the very first control. But if you can't even identify your authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users or devices, and limit system access to those as well, this is what's going to create what's called cascading effects throughout the rest of the assessment. And your assessment is going to fall apart extremely quickly.
And if you look at examine as well, that goes back to the point of VNFO controls, the documentation, the policies, the procedures that an assessor will be looking for in an assessment to demonstrate that you guys are actually doing it the way you're saying it.
Yeah.
Because, people hate this, but in the world of compliance and assessments, if it's not documented, we can't say it's happening.
That's right. We'll take also the next 311 Bravo, processes acting on behalf of authorized users are identified. These are going to be your traditional service accounts and automated scripts. And we want to identify how those are being done. And same thing, right? 311 Charlie, devices, including the other systems allowed to connect to the system, are identified. And usually we typically see, like, if somebody wants to add an endpoint to the system, we see some type of change request or something along those lines to add and remove devices off the system. The way that this control is set up, the first half of it, 311 Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, is based on documentation. And so now that you've identified to us how you do it in, i.e., organizational policies or procedures, then we get to 311 Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot, which is what type of technical configuration did you put in place in accordance with what you just documented. So for 311 Delta, the system access is limited to those authorized users. This is where employing things like Active Directory, role-based access control, things like that, keep that user to, which leads to the another control, right? Making sure that they have the principle of least privilege and those things assigned there. Same thing with 311 Charlie, right? You provided us the list of the processes acting on behalf of authorized users. Now we're going to want to see those service accounts or those automated scripts that match the documentation you provided us. And the same thing with the 311 Foxtrot, right? That the system access is limited to those authorized devices. So you provided us the list of the devices that are authorized to connect to the system. Now let's see those devices join, i.e., Entra ID join devices or any other devices you have connected to the system.
Yeah. That's great. And folks, if you just go back up to the control language, limit system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users and devices, including other systems. There's some things that are derived from that statement. Well, in order to limit, you have to identify, right? You got to have those things documented.
One of the things I always say, Jacob, like when I look at some of these controls, like this one in particular, if you're a contractor and you're not assessing to 171A and you're assessing yourself at the control level versus at the AO level, what's going to end up happening is you're going to assess these requirements and it's going to have a yes or no paradigm. Well, am I limiting system access to authorized users, processors, or devices? And you're going to say yes, and you're going to miss the part of actually identifying the authorized users, processes, and devices.
Yeah, exactly right. Do 800-171 Alpha, folks. It's really important.
Yes.
Now back to the assessment process. Next step is conduct assessment scoring. What does that look like?
So assessment scoring is each control has a particular value, right? So it's either going to be a 1-point value, 3-point value, or 5-point value. And with 5 being the most critical, that if that control were to be breached or compromised, then it would cause, significant damage to the confidentiality of CUI in that system. And so when we're going through the scoring, we're going through all of the scores. You start off with a perfect 110. And for every requirement that you don't meet, you're subtracted that point system off of your 110 score. So for example, you start off at a 110, but if you miss that first control, that 311, that's a 5 valued control. So you would now go from a 110 to a 105. The problem with that is that per the POAM in the CMMC rule, any point value greater than 1, i.e. a 3 or a 5, cannot be POAM. So that essentially creates a huge showstopper in your assessment. In order for something to be allowed to be POAM, there's 3 criteria that you have to meet. The first one is the score value has to be 80% or higher. So i.e. 88 out of the 110 controls. The second criteria is no 3 or 5 point valued controls can be POAM'd. And then the third criteria is a subset of 1 point valued controls cannot be POAM'd. So if you meet all 3 of those 3 criteria, the remaining controls that are allowed to be POAM'd can go onto your plan of action. And then at the end of the assessment, you'll be given a CMMC conditional level 2 certification.
Part of phase 2 is looking at the external service providers, evaluating the CRM. What does that actually look like?
It's really going to depend, right? So as the contractor using a external cloud service provider to process, store, transmit CUI, and then at that point, we're going to look at one of 2 things, right? We're going to look at, are they at least FedRAMP moderate authorized, which means that if they are, they're good to go. Or if they're not on the FedRAMP marketplace and they're not authorized, then the next step is we need to validate through the body of evidence that they're at least FedRAMP moderate equivalent in accordance with the DoD's memo from December 2023. And then the other piece is if the contractor is utilizing a managed service provider to help them with their environment. And so at that point, what we're looking at is for a customer or shared responsibility matrix to see what is that IT service provider or managed service provider responsible for, and what is the contractor responsible for. And so when they're both sitting at the table during the course of the assessment, each side will be able to speak to the maintenance of that control.
Okay, phase 2 is done. Now we're into phase 3. What happens in phase 3?
So in phase 3, what's going to end up happening is the assessment team is going to compile those assessment results. They're going to compile it in the required format to upload into EMAS. EMAS is the government system in where we upload our pre-assessment form and our assessment results form. And so this is hosted by the DoD. And then the QA will then conduct a quality assurance review to ensure accuracy and completeness, the evaluation of all those security requirements, as well as the conformance of the required reporting formats. The lead CCA is then going to convene an outbrief. And just like the in brief, they're going to take meeting minutes and any questions and answers that the contractor asks. Then the assessment team is going to instruct the OSC to hash all of the artifacts that was used as evidence during that assessment. And they have to retain it for 6 years. The contractor does. And then we ask the contractor to provide us the hash value and all of the artifacts of the hashing algorithm and the hashing algorithm that they use to hash all of their artifacts.
Now, does the assessor keep any of this assessment information?
We are only required to retain anything that the C3PAO has created during the course of the assessment. We're required to retain that for 6 years. But anything else that is proprietary to the contractor, i.e. their policies, procedures, system security plan, and any other relevant artifacts they provided to us, gets removed off our system.
Okay, all through the paperwork in phase 3. Now we're at the final piece, phase 4. What happens here?
So in phase 4, this is the final phase of the CMMC Level 2 certification assessment. And its primary purpose is for the C3PAO to issue a CMMC Level 2 certificate of status to the contractor and close out any plan of action and milestones that may exist. If the contractor has met all 110 requirements, then the C3PAO will issue what's called the CMMC Level 2 CMMC Level 2 certificate of status. But if the contractor has any open items on their plan of action and milestone, then the C3PAO shall issue what's called a CMMC Level 2 conditional certificate of CMMC status to them. And then if they have any open POAMs, the contractor, from the time we issue that cert, the contractor has 180 days to close out any POAM'd items. Or what's going to end up happening is if they don't close it out within 180 days, they would have to go through an entire assessment all over again.
I think that's really important to highlight, because if folks do have POAMs, you need to jump on those ASAP, because, I mean, we're about to find out even Fernando's availability. It's not a very busy person, and all the other C3PAOs are probably just nearly as busy, I'm sure. Yeah. So get on these quickly if you have them, because you got to coordinate with a C3PAO. Now, it doesn't have to be the same C3PAO though, right?
It does not. Nope. I think once you have a CMMC level 2 conditional certificate of status, I'm probably butchering the actual nomenclature, but once you have a CMMC level 2 conditional cert, then you can go back to the same C3PAO, or you can find another C3PAO to conduct your plan of action and milestone closeout assessment for you. When you're starting phase 1, right, the intent is when you come to a C3PAO for an assessment, we want you to come to us with the understanding that you've implemented all 110 requirements already. Not say, I'm coming to you with 88 requirements and then I've got these other ones that will POAM later, but we're pretty good on these other ones. I don't foresee that that's going to end well. The intent there is, right, come to the assessment in that, at least in your mind, that you've implemented all 110 requirements.
If you have POAMs, then I guess that's an additional conversation that you will have to negotiate with the C3PAO, or as you said, with another C3PAO to get that closeout assessment within 6 months.
Correct. So one or the other, the original C3PAO that conducted the initial assessment can be the one that comes back and closes it out, or you can contact another C3PAO and it would come and do the POAM closeout for you.
Hey folks, you may not know this, but I'm also leading a CMMC compliance program at a defense contractor. There's a lot involved with CMMC, and I understand how it can feel overwhelming. I was there myself many years ago, but since then, I've created CMMC training focused on defense contractors. The training covers everything from DFAR's contractual clauses to NIST 800-171A, and of course, CMMC. It's received over 100 5-star reviews and is certainly worth checking out. Find it at grcacademy.io. Now back to the episode.
Speaking to that availability problem of assessors, what is your availability right now? Like, when's the earliest someone could get an assessment with you?
So as of today, we are currently booked out through early November.
Wow. Well, how many C3PAOs are on the CyberAV marketplace right now?
There are currently 54 authorized C3PAOs on the marketplace, and I believe there's some more that are pre-authorized C3PAOs, but that haven't gone through the full authorization process. But as of the time of this recording, there are 54 authorized C3PAOs.
What is the difference between a C3PAO and assessor? Because they just can't call an assessor and say, hey, assess me, please. Because there's a few hundred assessors, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But as you said, only 54 C3PAOs. Why is that significant?
When it comes to C3PAOs, look at them as the assessment organization, right? The organization as a whole that can actually go out there and conduct the assessment. The assessors work for those assessment organizations. So there's only 54 organizations right now that are authorized to conduct those assessments. And so it's better for you to contact the C3PAO directly and find out if they have availability for you, because they're the ones that are going to have not only the CCAs, but the lead CCAs on staff to conduct those assessments for you.
Give us some advice to help us find the right C3PAO for our organization.
When CMMC begins, I mean, you're not going to have a lot of options in whether you're choosing to comply or not comply with CMMC. But one of the things that's well within your control as a contractor is selecting the right C3PAO for you. So this is where I encourage folks, go onto the CyberAV marketplace and contact one of those 54 C3PAOs, or contact a few of them. Have conversations about them, right? Find out, have they assessed environments that are similar to yours? Are they familiar with your tech stack? Most importantly, are they familiar with, processes that you might put in front of them? One thing that I want to caveat, please do not only look at price, just like everything else, right? You get what you pay for. You always want to make sure that you're going into it, get the entire holistic view, make sure there's a good personality fit, make sure there's a good cultural fit, make sure there's a good fit for the technology stack that you're using, and that they've actually assessed other or like-minded environments like yours.
That's great advice. I am a CMMC certified professional. Sir, yes, sir. But in any case, I would not be comfortable assessing a manufacturer. I just don't have experience in that space. You know what I mean? So it's really important, as you said, find the right C3PAO and ask about their assessors. Make sure they have experience and can understand your operating environment. So critical.
Agreed.
Thank you for that. Where can people find you?
You can find us on our website at cybersecinvestments.com. You can find us on the Cyber AV Marketplace. I myself am there as a CCP, a CCA, and a lead CCA. And then you can find our organization on there, Cybersec Investments, on the authorized C3PAO page.
Fernando, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you for having me.
Hey folks, hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.